Hey, what's up, guys? Little man with a big opinion here. I got some notes here for some news stories that I want to discuss. The biggest one is this school shooting that happened yesterday at a Catholic school. There's more information that's coming out. I was watching Timcast last night, and something that they said on there. If I had been there, I could have added just a little bit more to what they were saying. Um, and that is when I make these YouTube videos, like today I'm making it and then I'm going to post it. But the last few days I've made it the night before and scheduled it for 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, around that time period. And that just adds to the idea that this entire thing was, premeditative, because there's a video released on the, horrible person's YouTube channel. It was scheduled. It showed, manifesto type stuff. It showed that, this entire thing was planned, and we got the best worst case scenario in the fact that this person chose to end their life. The damage has been done, but I can sleep a little bit better at night knowing that, we're not feeding, housing, and taking care of this person for the duration of their time in prison like they probably would have had. But I can see the death sentence not happening because 20 plus years of appeals and all that kind of issues. It's already turned into a political fight saying prayers aren't enough, ban the guns, and that's one side. The other side talking about how this individual has something mental going on. One of the things that they talked about was this individual had transitioned with their parents' approval. Their parents supported this person, and so we don't quite know the entire story yet, but it kind of adds to the what should be done category. I'm no expert, but I think a disassociation with religion has a really big part to play in this. And so I'll leave that at that. The solution that I believe is the right solution is arming the teachers. I'm in education myself. I am fortunate enough that where I live, not only do we have, armed, like school resource officers, but we also have the guardianship program. I'm a part of it. I'm glad that I went through the stuff to be a part of it. And it's one of those things that no one is going to know, except for you guys that watch my videos. And the bad person that wants to do bad things, when the time comes. There is hundreds of thousands of documented cases every single year of people using a firearm to deter a crime or to stop a crime. I'm 5'2". I work out 4 to 5 times a week. I'd say I'm in, fairly good physical shape. I felt really proud when my watch said my fitness age was 23. And I'm a few months away from being 28. But there is a lot of physical things that without having that equalizer, I don't think I could, make it through certain situations. I think that goes past the school. That idea of I'm going to do something evil, bad, dumb, whatever you want to call it, that involves me using a firearm to increase, my lethality. I think a lot of that would go down if more people were armed. I can comfortably say that if I was going to go in and rob someone, why would I do it at the police station where I know every single one of those people have a firearm and they're going to try to stop a crime? If I went to Walmart, which in my area, it would kind of be, sketchy. That thought process of, some people open carry, it's typically the older people. But I can walk into Walmart and have absolutely no idea if anyone in there is carrying. I'm making the assumption that everyone that looks like they're over the age of 22 is carrying a firearm. It also makes me feel very good because, I think an armed society is a polite society. I don't want to have to use my firearm to stop some sort of crime. But I also think there's a certain level of duty from stopping that to happen. And I would much rather be prepared, willing, and able to do it. So that's what I have to say about that first story. The crackdowns in DC. The mayor there is talking about living in a time of terror. They've released crime stats over the last 2 weeks since it started. Crime's down 23%. Violent crime across the board. I don't think 2 weeks is enough time to really start boasting and getting excited about it. I think you need a longer period. She brought up one decent point, saying that DC has a plan to hire 500 new officers, to meet their growing demands. And the one thing that she said that I kind of liked was, unless this is going to happen forever, which I don't personally want it to happen forever, it kind of takes away from the local, DC law enforcement. In the sense of, I can see it putting in people's heads, the military's here. That means our police can't do their job. Which means other things need to change. They need to be, more consistent on certain things. There's reform that needs to happen. Because I think that partially that is a loss of trust within your personal police department. If my local town had to bring in 50, additional law enforcement to keep up with stuff, and then you see all over the news, they did this drug bust, they stopped this, high-speed chase, they are dealing with all these problems, the locals might stop and look at that and go, wait a minute, why aren't these guys our police to begin with? Let's get rid of who we have. And some of that makes sense. Maybe you have people that, just aren't quite cut out for that job. But, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt and say, they need some more training. They need more practice. They need to do things to get better at their job. So, it's kind of up in the air, but, the good part of that is when you have more of a law enforcement presence, the crime is going down. It's not just that, it's also, they are enforcing the laws that are there. When you enforce the laws that are there, you typically have less, unrest. Less crime means more people want to go out and do business, and it benefits your society as a whole. I don't think we're ever going to get to 0% in certain things unless we got super, super strict. And even getting super strict, you always have dumb people that do dumb decisions. Tying that into prepping, you've got your set of morals and your codes and how you're going to do stuff. Stick with it. Don't cave and give in to stuff, and you'll probably be just fine. Specifically homicide and robbery were the biggest things that went down. The more presence of people stopping crimes has convinced people that we should stop taking other people's stuff. That goes back to, the main argument with the first thing. I've always heard the argument, you value your stuff over someone's life, and the counter argument is they valued my stuff over their life. Where I live, break-ins are very, very low. And I think it has to do with gun ownership. And that person is mentally telling themselves, the dollar amount of something that I'm going to steal is not worth my life. I firmly agree with that. I also live next door to my grandmother and my wheelchair-bound cousin. I've told my cousin, we're going out, we're, practicing shooting a handgun. I know I'm right next door, but you are the fastest thing to deal with a situation. And I want you to be capable of dealing with the situation until additional help can get there. The firearm is the great equalizer in this whole situation. And then the last thing that I thought was cool, because it happened like an hour before I started writing stuff down for this video, is the Atomic General's YFQ 42 fighter. They used a giant acronym that basically means it's an unmanned fighter jet. It did its first successful test flight today, which is super impressive considering it's still in its R&D stage, and it only started about 2 years ago. That is one thing that AI and computers are really doing well at, is, cutting down on R&D. They're able to do so many simulations and test products and input data, and it spits it right back out. And that's why, electrical demand is going to skyrocket to power these facilities, and the storage required, and it's impressive. I watched a video about China's new bomber that looks very similar to the B-2 when we're getting ready to release the B-21 Raider. The B-2 took like 25 years of R&D. We've had it around for decades now. And everything I've read about the B-21 is in every way better. Cheaper, faster, lower signature. The payload does get cut in half, but it's about half the price. It's easier to maintain. So I'm excited about that. But this is going to help augment, fighter pilots. This is going to make it, and they haven't fully released the price. We've got guesstimates, but they were saying we could lose like 4 or 5 of these to the price of the physical jet. And it didn't take into consideration the years of training that the pilot gets. I think it's going to be a nice deterrent for future wars. I think it'll be used very, very well. It shows at some levels that our military is doing good things. The Army's working with the M5 Ripsaw and a couple of other companies to do an unmanned, it's smaller than a striker, but has similar capabilities. It's crazy stuff that makes me as a prepper think a World War III might not happen on our soil. I would still plan out food production, water storage, all of that sort of things for supply chain disruptions. And also, like, I talked to my students about victory gardens the other day and how they were producing enough food to feed 10 or 15 million people a year with backyard gardens. Eleanor Roosevelt did a victory garden. And I've watched plenty of videos on being able to grow and produce, with some livestock and the food that you need on 1.5 acres. It's not the easiest thing, but it's possible. That's hearing about the YFQ 42. I don't even know what YFQ stands for. Fighters, something or another. It does make me want to pivot certain things. I know preppers love the idea of their firearms and, fighting off something tyrannical. I still think you should buy that stuff. I still think that's like the bread and butter of the YouTube stuff, is showing off a firearm and shooting it and blowing stuff up or whatever. My argument for this is, in some ways it makes it easier to deal with your adversary, because I see other countries doing this as well. We've seen the drones in Ukraine, and more and more autonomous fighting with the soldier on a PlayStation remote doing the fighting. Now we have to build better infrastructure to protect those people and continue to get signals out, and having a this is why Space Force is a thing, because a lot of this futuristic fighting is going to require their capabilities. I also think it'd be very easy if you could cut we get to the point where half of our aircraft are these you're basically playing Battlefield. You're flying a plane that you can take more risks because the soldier's not going to die, but you have the ability to cut the power to the facility controlling it, and now it just falls out of the sky and it's gone. So we're still going to need the physical soldier protecting stuff, the Minutemen, that kind of thing, but it does set up new challenges as preppers. I actually watched a video the other day talking about building a jammer, and he built one that basically jams every single commercial drone out there. It's what Ukraine and Russia are doing to try to combat all of the drones being used, because some of the drones that Ukraine's using, I mean, they strap a grenade to a $50 drone that can fly 300 meters, and they're taking out tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands worth of equipment. And they made a $50 jammer that makes it to where once its signal gets in range, it basically falls from the sky. It's redneck sci-fi is what I kind of think it is. But generally speaking, as a prepper, I think you should mainly focus on food and water. Then you cover security, medical, communications, things like that. This weekend I'm going to try freeze-drying some cooked ground beef, because I could have bought a package that had 3 pounds in it. It only weighed like 16 ounces. Removing 99% of the water makes the weight go down a lot. It makes it last 25 years. But it was $53. There's not a whole lot of companies out there doing this. I can spend the $3 or less, maybe $1.50 on the electricity to run the machine, buy the 80/20 ground beef, cook it, get another 10 to 13% of the fat out of it, so it turns into lean ground beef, for $5 a pound, $4 a pound. So even with the oxygen absorber and the package, we're still looking at, a third of the cost. And if we decide to eat this in 10 years, there's no telling what the price of beef would be. The texture stays relatively the same. I'll make a video on it. I'll show you what I'm doing. But the military's upgrading, so I think preppers should upgrade. I think we should be paying attention to the news out there and, subscribing to this channel, liking it, sharing it with your friends and families, because that's how we grow and that's how we get better. If you got any questions, leave them down below. I'm still small. I'll answer basically every single one of them. And with that, catch you on the next one.